Hello and welcome to episode 55 of On Liberty, coming to you live from the Center for Independent Studies in Sydney, Australia. I'm your host, Salvatore Babones, and joining me today is Professor David Goodman, Professor Emeritus of Chinese Politics at the University of Sydney. We'll be asking David to help us understand the true role played by the Communist Party of China in Chinese society, past and present. David Goodman, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm looking forward to hearing about the true role. You know, being an academic, I'm very wary of anything that describes itself as true in inverted commas and flashing neon signs.
Describe itself, it described you. So you tell us, look, just to give us some broad orientation, with more than 90 million members, can we put our finger on it? What is the Communist Party of China?
Well, it's a number of things. I suppose the most important thing is it's the source of political authority in China, no question about it. And it determines governance, it has a huge bureaucracy which spreads out throughout every part of the political system, the social system, and indeed the economic system. So, and to the extent that the party from the top controls anything, it does it through those bureaucracies, those hierarchies with officials and party committees. Now that's a very simple introduction, but the party also has a couple of other fairly obvious roles in the kind of party state that China is. It's also very much a social animal. So if you're a young person of talent, a young person who wants to have a career, not necessarily in public service, but just wants to get ahead and beyond and ahead, you will join the Communist Party. It's a social thing. It's a social entity. And it has very deep social roots because it's been there for a long time, particularly in some parts of China. It has deep social roots going back even to before 1949. And as you can imagine, and as we may elaborate later, that influences who the dominant class are and who the middle class people are and how they get jobs and what they do, as well as, of course, its prime role, which is looking after officialdom and the politics of the system. The party is also, of course, sorry?
No, please.
No, I've forgotten what it was I was going to say. It doesn't matter. You asked. You go ahead.
In that case, I want to get back to that issue about the social aspects of the party, but let me just ask first about the bureaucratic side. I'm used to thinking of a government as bureaucratic, and we all have this idea in mind of a Chinese bureaucracy, but there's also a party bureaucracy. How does that work?
Well, it works very easily. So the notion of a party state is inherited basically from the Soviet Union way back when there was a Soviet Union. Some of you may be old enough to remember when it existed. But a Communist Party state works like this. There is a government organization, which we would recognize here. For example, a federal government, state governments, local councils, all that stuff. But in China, alongside the governmental hierarchy, there is a party hierarchy. And the party hierarchy, in theory, looks after policy and appointments of leaders in the government sector. Now, the problem, of course, with the party state is not always, but almost always, there is a tendency for the party to get involved in the business of the government. Oh, I should perhaps explain that the reason for this theoretical divide is that the party, which is the representative of the people, we can go into that, how that works if you like, but the party which is the representative of the people makes policy. Policy is then implemented by government. It's a kind of, it's a bit like having standing out in the rain, but making sure you have an umbrella up in case any rain falls, so it doesn't fall. It's a shield.
Now, who are we? I mentioned Communist Party of China has 90 million members. That's 10% of the adult population. Who are these people? Who joins the?
Of their parents are leading officials and so on. They join to get on ahead. There's no question about it. And if they want a career in public service, which is still very valued, then they join the party too. Please don't think that just because China has a large economy with fantastic growth rates, that the wealth in China is like the wealth here. GDP per capita in China is very low. It's only about the same as the world average for GDP per capita. Whereas, you know, we're in Australia, we're way up almost the same level as, close to the level by comparison to the United States. So if you want to get ahead, many families will say they want their children to get ahead. Oh, you should have a job in public service. And there's huge differences, of course, between rural and urban China. Now, I won't get it. Let me stay with the story about the party and its role in society, because in the past, that's to say in the revolutionary era of the People's Republic of China between 1949 and 1978, the social composition of the party was much more what we might recognize as ordinary people, workers, peasants, soldiers, and the like. Now, the percentage of rural dwellers in the party is much less. The percentage of middle-class people is much higher. And when we talk about middle-class people in China, we shouldn't think that they're necessarily people, in fact, we should almost necessarily think they're not people who come from private enterprise or are in some way separate from the party state. The party state has its fingers into most things economic, most things educational, health, welfare, and the like. And those are the people, the middle classes, the professional middle classes in particular, but also the entrepreneurial middle classes. They are the people who are now the largest section alongside the cadres and the officials in the party membership. Young people at university will be encouraged to join. But remember, who goes to university in China? About 25% of the school leaving population. Again, not the same as Australia or other parts of Europe or North America or England or whatever.
Some of our viewers, Anthony, Winton, Peter, thank you for joining us today. Anyone else who's out there who'd like to get a call out, please put your name in the comments. Also, please start getting your questions for David in. We will have time for viewer questions if there's anything you'd like to ask Professor David Goodman today. David, you and I both are social scientists. You mentioned the middle class. Now, classically, for me, the middle class means professionals, doctors, teachers, lawyers, accountants. To what extent is the Communist Party today, or even in the past, a party of the professional class? Are these classic middle class professionals who make up the bulk of the Communist Party?
So there are really, in China, China is not, despite its practices in many regards, its practices of capitalism. It's not a capitalist society. It's not run for the benefit of capitalists or capitalist procedures or any of that stuff. It's what is described by China itself as a market socialist economy, which you might also regard as a form of capitalism, but state capitalism, although the theory of state capitalism has a different trajectory. About 25% of the economy is still run by state-owned enterprises. Or when I say 25% of the economy, 20% of the value produced by the economy is from state-owned enterprises. But it's not as productive as the non-state sector. But even the non-state sector is not really non-state. Substantial proportions of the non-state economy are actually part of local government, which you might also regard in some ways as a state economy. Why am I telling if we follow Giddens in accepting those dominant classes, the middle classes and subordinate classes, well, the dominant class and the subordinate class in the case of China are fairly easy to identify. The subordinate classes are the workers and peasants who have, as Giddens would say, a class position by virtue of their manual labor. The dominant class are those who control or own, but not necessarily, but may also control the means of production. Now that might be and we'll come back to that in a minute, it might be the owners of capital, but it's more likely to be in a Communist Party state, regardless of the degree of market socialism. It's also likely to be, it's more likely to be officials and cadres and people who manage state-owned enterprises and determine the way the economy works. Basically, that's the dominant class. So who does that leave as the middle classes? Well, in the Giddens definition of the middle class, it's the people who have their class position by virtue of their knowledge, their skills, and their experience. In China, a goodly proportion of those people are not just educated, but are actually part of the party state system. That's how they got educated, that's how they have their positions, they run things, they manage things, all under, to either an aggressor or usually a lesser or usually a greater extent, the direction of the party and the party committee at various levels. Now, the mystery in all this, and I would define them as a professional, the middle class as a professional middle class, as you say, an entrepreneurial middle class, and a managerial middle class. The managerial, you'll understand, is necessary because of the nature of the management of society by a Communist Party state. That's fine. Why would one include entrepreneurs in the middle class and not in the dominant class? It's a discussion I've had with colleagues in China very often, particularly at China's Academy of Social Sciences. And I think they've convinced me, I mean, not recently, about 10 years ago, a number of people there convinced me that actually you shouldn't talk about entrepreneurs, however wealthy and however influential you think they are, as being part of the dominant class. Because this is not a political economy that's run for capitalists. They are subservient to the party. They are subservient, as the party would see it, to the will of the people, or at least the will of the proletariat and the state. And so they are part of. Now, there's another fairly simple reason for taking entrepreneurs as part of the middle class, and that is that most entrepreneurs, despite the fame that some of them get, like Jack Ma and so on, the vast majority of entrepreneurs in China are not particularly wealthy. There are some at local level, at provincial level, who are fairly well off, yes, but there would be about maybe 11 million entrepreneurs. That category in China includes people who sell brushes on the street because they're self-employed business people. So it's a very, very wide category. And unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately from the point of view of the party state, the National Bureau of Statistics, which gives us data on these things, is a bit weak on distinguishing all those different categories.
You mentioned Jack Ma, and Jack Ma, of course, the founder of Alibaba, and he had trouble with his floating of Ant Financial and the issue over his criticisms of financial regulation in China. He was disappeared from public view for several months. Are people like Jack Ma and Pony Ma, the founder of Tencent, do they really not have substantial power in China? Are they very much under the thumb of the party?
No, I don't think they're under the thumb, but it's an accommodation between the two sides and they work together. And of course, Jack Ma, once he decided to stand down and float his company and so on, then declared that he was a member of the Chinese Communist Party. Nobody's ever found out when he actually joined. It's possible he only joined after he stepped down, but somehow one suspects that is not the case. Very, very wealthy business people get wheeled out at National People's Congresses, which is the equivalent of, well, kind of the equivalent of the parliament in a liberal democracy. They get wheeled out, they come, they're part of the, in attendance, they're members often, they're representatives to parliament in one of its different manifestations, various manifestations. And so they participate in that sense in the political process. But at the end of the day, every business person knows that if the chips are down, they don't have the say over things. Let me give you an example. there is labour shortage. This is not about Jack Ma, this is about other things, but it's the same principle, you'll understand. There's labour shortages, particularly in East and South China, where light industry has been going great guns for the last few decades. A lot of workers have come in from the interior of China, but there's still a labour shortage. So you are a factory owner in one of the East Coast provinces. You haven't got enough people. What do? You go to a neighboring factory and you talk to the person who's responsible for the recruitment of the labor force there, and you say, bring these guys over. We can do, we'll pay them more for doing the same kind of job. Remember that a large part of light industry in China is the production of things is very concentrated. So you tend to have textiles together, carbon production together, all kinds of things, So you go to a nearby factory and say, bring your workforce over, we'll pay them more. So the ganga brings his people over, and then you don't pay them. What then happens? Well, there's a strike, or there's a bit of aggro, or there's something like that. And what then happens? The local party secretary comes and sees the factory owner and says, I hear you made a promise you're not keeping. Now, I'm afraid that's not going to happen on my watch. And of course, it's not going to happen on his watch, because they get assessed, cadres, local officials get assessed every year, and they get assessed not just for pure economic growth, but for social stability, for environmental sustainability. There's a whole checklist of things. So if this guy knows there's going to be a riot, or fears there's going to be a riot on his patch because of some factory owner, he goes and tells him, no, you're going to pay because of this. And the factory owner has no choice.
So I want to draw an interesting to me distinction there, because we have a question from Anthony, who is citing the Harvard Kennedy School survey data on China, showing that Chinese people seem to be satisfied with the performance of the central government, but report very low levels of satisfaction.
That's completely correct.
With
and
local government.
That of course is always the way in an authoritarian political system. You will remember, or maybe you won't remember, but because neither of us is this old, but during the famines in the Soviet Union, people used to write to Stalin and say, the local, people would write and say, the local cadres here are keeping the grain from us. Please, comrade Stalin, help us. In the Great Leap Forward in China, people wrote to Mao and said, this local or this provincial official is no good. Chairman Mao, you have our best interests at heart. You must get rid of this person. All that stuff, all those documents came out in the Cultural Revolution when the Maoists turned on the established party leaders from the 50s and 60s. They brought out of the files all this stuff. So it's common knowledge that these letters were written, these things were said. Nothing changed. That doesn't mean, of course, that the party is not popular.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. Is it the party? Do people distinguish between that party cadre who is solving their local problem and the local government, which maybe is not listening to them? Or do people simply conflate local party and local government as being the same thing?
It's very varied. Most of the time it's conflation, but it's not always like that. If you're working in a university, it's very clear who's government and who's party. I mean, in your case, as I found when I was working there for the last decade. But in general terms, it's hard to distinguish. For most people, I think they don't think in those terms. They think into, they don't talk about the party state. We do as analysts. But that's basically what they're talking about.
So if local cadres are solving people's problems at, not getting paid, why are they so unpopular with local people?
Oh, well, I mean, that's not what that survey showed. What that survey showed was that the national cadres were more popular. There's a degree of distrust with people who you live with. That's basically what it is.
Christopher's asking us, how serious is the Communist Party leadership today about their adherence to Marxism and Leninism? And maybe if you want to unpack Marxism versus Leninism in that answer, what are your thoughts on the party's ideological commitment?
Well, I have a very good friend who works at Sydney, actually, and we argue about the nature of Marxism all the time. He claims that if you're analyzing China, you have to accept the party's definitions and theories within Marxism, and he has a point. I object to that because I just think when you're writing about it, you need to be able to say, well, that's their Marxism and this is other people's, because it's gone a long way. Marxism as a set of ideas has gone a long way since almost 150 years ago. Marxism-Leninism is a term that's been used to describe Communist parties, the practices and procedures of Communist Party states. China itself has, the PRC, that is, the Communist Party of China, have at times made distinctions between themselves and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. I'm not sure that that's worth going into very much. If you think that Marxism is about the freeing of the human spirit, and there are people who think that, and that should come before everything else, then you would definitely say that the Chinese Communist Party is not Chinese, is not Marxist, rather, because what they care about is economic growth, nationalism, state nationalism, and keeping control of the political system. Now, if you're the kind of Marxist that Trotsky was, you would object very strongly to probably all three of those things, certainly to two of them, namely nationalism and control under all costs. It's very interesting. Deng Xiaoping in the early 1940s actually said, and it's well known, it's well documented, that communist parties, when they compete in elections, don't necessarily have to be in control, don't necessarily want to be in control. They want to hear the voice of the people. Now, when he said it, they were mobilizing people in North China during the war of resistance against Japan, and it was before the establishment of the People's Republic of China. But you know, if the Communist Party of China wishes to have a history to lean back on for competitive elections, it only has to go to things that he said at that time, and other people too, to find a legacy to lean on.
Chris wants to ask about the top talent in the public bureaucracy in China. He points out that the role of the scholar official was historically very important in China, and he's wondering if the party plays some kind of similar role to the old mandarinate of imperial China.
Well, I mean, on a very superficial level, you might say yes, but my real answer to that question would be to say, this is a different kind of state to the imperial dynastic state, the unity to stop famine as much as it could, and so on, to stop invasion, and so on and so forth. This is a Communist Party state. It's trying, at its heart, it's trying to win the battle against nature, and even to some extent against human nature. It's trying to make what it sees as a better society in very specific ways. So it's not really like the Mandarin. Now, having said that, what fascinates me from the sociological point of view is the extent to which people who are now in the dominant class and have their social status derived from party leadership and so on, a goodly proportion of them, and indeed a goodly proportion of entrepreneurs, come from the old pre-1949 and even longer ruling class. Local elites who were, exactly as Chris has said, from the scholar gentry. People who owned land, who had a son, who was educated in order to join in the service of the imperial court, and so on and so forth. I did a survey finished about 9 years ago, started about 14 years ago. I did a survey of literally 500, up to 500, about 475, very rich people in 5 different locations. 82% of them had at least one grandparent who, before 1949, were part of the old scholar gentry ruling elite. Staggering, eh?
It is staggering, and I think in a way it shows that Mao was right when he said the revolution was not complete. Whatever we may think of the revolution, certainly your own work seems...
Salvatore, I could not agree with you more. Whatever we think of the revolution,
Right.
he was right about that. And in a sense, that question about Marxism, much more interesting to ask is whether Mao's interpretation of Marxism and what happened up until his death has been reversed or not. That's a much more interesting question. Yeah. I think to be honest, you know, although it would be unpopular to say so in Beijing, I think there's some evidence that needs to be answered with respect to that. I mentioned before that workers and peasants used to be a larger proportion of the party membership than is the case now. It's certainly the case that the contemporary dominant class has its roots in both a kind of new class that was created in the 50s and 60s and the old dominant local elite. Now, having said that, I'm not going back on what I'm talking about workers and peasants, but the fact of the matter was that even in 1949, the rulers of China who had come out of the revolutionary movement, more than a quarter of them, almost a third, had backgrounds in the old local elite ruling class. It could not have been otherwise, really, when you think about it. Revolutionary movements are often like that. The question is not about your social background, but about your social ideas. And what I think the party would say now is that on the one hand, historical conditions change, which they do, and the other, well, we are serving the interests of everybody by doing what we're doing.
Unfortunately, we have to wrap up very soon. I do want to say a quick hello to Elizabeth, to Chris, to Michael. Michael did have a quick question about the status of the Catholic Church in China. Can you tell us at all about the status of the Catholic Church or other Christian churches in China today?
Well, I'm not a great authority on Christianity, save for one thing. I spent a large part of my time in China, not recently, but in the distant past, in Shanxi province. Shanxi province has no non-ethnic Han Chinese, non-ethnic Chinese, but it does have about 5 million Catholics, rural Catholics, out of about 35 million. How does that happen? Because starting in the 17th century, Jesuit missionaries and Dominican missionaries and various other people came to this province, which is about 800 kilometers from 500 to 800 kilometers from Beijing, and they brought Catholicism with them, and they did it in the usual way of taking, winning over rural landlords and setting themselves up in villages. So if you go to the southeast of that province, you find an awful lot of churches and a lot of Catholics. Now the question, of course, the real question is it Roman Catholic? Well, it's not. It has a Roman Catholic tradition, but it is now the state has determined that you can be a Catholic, but you have to be part of the national Catholic Church. They have, as Chris probably, was it Chris who answered the question? I can't remember.
Michael.
Well, Michael probably knows that in recent years there have been movements towards accommodation between Rome and Beijing over Catholic bishops and the like. The essential problem for the Catholic Church in this context is that Rome appoints bishops, but Beijing says it can't. So, but people believe, and it becomes in some areas of the country, it can be like Shanxi, it can be quite fundamentally important.
Apologize to you and to everyone watching for running over time, but there is one final question I absolutely have to ask you, and that is, has Australia really, quote, hurt the feelings of the Chinese people?
Well, I don't know who Australia is, and I'm not sure I know who the Chinese is, to be perfectly honest. I mean, this is, at the moment, this is a war of words.
Okay.
What I do know is that many of my friends, I got back from China in March, late March. What I do know is that since I got back, many of my friends have got in touch with me and said, we hear that the Australian economy is crumbling. Are you okay? So I have to try and reassure.
Well, let's reassure everyone that things are really not moving towards the kinds of conflict we hear advertised in the press. I think we have a much more promising future for Australia and China than either country would like to admit right now.
Right now, yes, I think that's probably my hope.
Right. David
Thank you
Goodman,
very much, Salvatore.
thank you for joining us today. Let me also thank Nico Malian, our producer, our executive producer Max Hawk-Weaver, the director of CIS is Tom Switzer. Next week, we'll be talking to Professor Bob Graham of the Victor Chang Cardiac Research Institute about spiders and stroke. And no, it's not about how you have a stroke if you see the spider. You'll be amazed how spiders are actually going to be saving us from stroke in the future. Thanks everyone for watching, and we look forward to you seeing us here on Liberty next week.